Okay, so it's time to begin the finishing of my sweater, of our sweater. So I've got my back here, and I've got my front piece here, washed and dried, and I've got my two sleeves at my corrected length. So two sleeve pieces, again, I've washed them and laid flat to dry, and so it's time to get on to the next piece. I'm going to put the sleeves away for a second here because the first instruction on the finishing, let's see, is to seam up the shoulders. Place stitches for left shoulder for front and back on needles. Work the 3 needle bind off and repeat for the right shoulder. Okay, so I'm going to put my sleeves to the side here for a second, and I'm going to begin by putting my, let's see, I guess it doesn't really matter. They're telling us to do the left shoulder first. So when the sweater is facing you, that's always the opposite shoulder. So I'm going to put the left shoulder for my front back on my needles. And for this maneuver, because the shoulder is quite short, I'm going to use double pointed needles because the 3 needle bind off requires 3 needles, and sometimes it's just easier to use double pointed needles. This first stitch, so again, you follow your waste yarn along here, counting your stitches as you go, and just pop them back onto your needle. And then I'm going to pull out my waste yarn. So I've got all my stitches back on my needle, and now I need to find the corresponding left side on my back. So obviously when I put my shoulders together, I have the right sides facing out. And you can match up the armholes underneath. Okay, so that you can see that you've got the right side. So this is my left shoulder for the back. And so I'm going to, again, put it on a double pointed needle. The waste yarn that I was using for this side is actually the tie that was on the wool stock yarn. So I got to use the tie from the 150 gram. I just saved it when I wound up my yarn, saved it because it's nice and silky. It's a slightly different color than the yarn, so pretty easy to find. And I'll pull that one out. So before you begin the 3 needle bind off, count your stitches. You need to have the same number of stitches on each of your needles. And so if you don't have the same number of stitches, now is the time when you can adjust it. You could maybe pull up a stitch to make an extra one, or you could knit 2 together over here just to make sure that you have the same number of stitches. So I'm just going to do that first. Okay, so I have the same number of stitches on each of my shoulders. Good, I'm good to go. The second decision you can make is whether or not you want to have the seam, because when you do a 3 needle bind off, you will be creating a seam, whether you want that to be visible on the outside or invisible on the inside. If you want your seam to be invisible, then turn your pieces so that the right sides are facing in, and you'll do your 3 needle bind off on the inside of your sweater. Again, just make sure to match up your armholes so that you're sewing the right front to the right back, or the left front to the left back. Just make sure everything matches up. But what I'm going to do is put my 3 needle bind off on the outside, because I kind of like the way that it matches with these ridges here. So I'm going to have my 3 needle bind off be visible. It doesn't matter whether you do it on the inside or the outside. The technique is the same. You just need to make a decision about where you want to put your 3-needle bind off. And again, just make sure that you've lined up the underarms of your front and back with the top of the shoulder, and begin over here. I left myself a nice long tail when I finished the front, and so I'm going to use that tail to do my 3-needle bind off. So for a 3-needle bind off, you need a 3rd needle. And what you're going to do is you're going to begin by knitting the first stitch on either of these 2 needles. So I've got 20 stitches on each of these needles. I'm holding the needles that have the stitches on them so that they are parallel to each other. And then my 3rd needle I'm going to use to knit the stitches together and to bind them off. So there's kind of like 2 steps to this process. The first step is that we're going to knit together the first stitch on each of these needles. So these 2 stitches will become 1. And then we're going to knit the second stitch and we'll take them off, and then we'll knit the next 2 pairs of stitches from each needle together, and then we'll pass the first knitted stitch over the second knitted stitch. Okay, so let's start with the first step, which is to knit these first 2 stitches together. So I'm inserting my 3rd needle into the first stitch on my front needle and into the first stitch on my back needle. Since they're parallel, I'll say that this one that's closest to me is the front needle, and this one that's further away is the back needle. Wrap your yarn around and bring that yarn through both loops, both the loop on this needle and the loop on this needle. And then you can pull both those loops off. They're joined together like that. And then insert your needle into the next stitch on your front needle and the next stitch on your back needle and knit them together. If you have a hard time pulling the yarn through both stitches, you can do it 1 stitch at a time. So here I am pulling the yarn through the stitch on my back needle and then through the stitch on my front needle, and then you can take both those stitches off. Once you have 2 stitches on your 3rd needle, you can bind off. So you'll pass the earlier stitch over the later stitch, and that's 1 stitch bound off. Then you knit the next 2 pairs of stitches together from the front needle and from the back needle, yarn over, pull through both stitches, take those stitches off the needle, and now pass the earlier stitch on your 3rd needle over the later stitch on your 3rd needle. And then do it again. So when you bind off, you have to have 2 stitches on your 3rd needle. You'll pass the stitch that you made before over the stitch that you just made, and then go back to creating, binding these 2 stitches together and knitting them together, and then passing them over. You want to do this, you don't want to do it extremely loose, but you don't want to do it extremely tight either. You don't want to create a seam that is you don't want it to be too tight or too loose, so you want it to have a little bit of stretch in here, but you don't want it to be gappy either. So just take your time, play with your seam as you go to make sure you have a little bit of give in there. Okay, so you don't want to feel, sometimes I think about it as feeling a bone in there. If you can't pull those stitches apart, it's probably too tight. And if you're kind of seeing gaps in there, then it's too loose. Or if it's roughly on the top, it's too loose. So just keep working your way across the seam. And again, if you're working on the inside of your sweater, it's exactly the same way. When you get to your last 2 stitches, you'll end up with just 2 stitches on your 3rd needle. You'll pass the earlier one over the later one. And then if you aren't working with a tail of yarn, if you're working with an actual ball, you'll cut your yarn and then just pull that loop free. Just pull the loop right through. That means that you don't end up with an extra knot over here, and you can just weave this end in. It's actually going to get woven in underneath, on the underneath side here. Here we go. Okay, So if you started a new piece of yarn here at the shoulder, you'll have another tail over here that you're going to weave in. You have a tail over here. I've got a couple of tails I'm going to weave in, but you see that my seam has some give to it, but yet it kind of snaps back into place. So it's not too loose. If it was too loose, it might end up being kind of ruffly up there. And so I just like the way that that seam looks in relation to the other purl lines that I have there. Okay, so once you've done one shoulder seam, then you move over and you do the other one in exactly the same way. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is look to find my longest tail. So the longest piece of yarn, the longest tail I have here is over on this side. So I'll pull out my little knot here. And so I'm going to work my bind off using this tail, which means I'm going to work from this side to this side. Okay, so that decision's just made on the basis of having a longer tail to use here. And because we work from the right to the left, I'm going to turn everything over here so that the tail that I'm using is on the right side. So it doesn't matter whether, I guess it matters in a way that when you bind off, you'll get like a row of stitches. You see how this row is kind of going in this direction. The little arrows or the hearts are pointing in this direction, and so when I bind off here, my arrows are going to go in that direction. So if you were, if you wanted them to be symmetrical or mirror image of each other, then it would be important to go from, say, the neckline to the outside shoulder edge on both sides. I'm not sure if that's what I'm doing or not. I'm pretty sure no one's going to look that closely at my shoulders, but if it mattered to you that your bind off goes in the same direction, then you could choose to go from neckline to shoulder or shoulder to neckline on both sides. Of course, if you're doing this 3-needle bind off on the inside of your sweater, makes no difference at all because you're not going to see it on the outside. Okay, so again, just to review those steps, you're going to take your 3rd needle, insert it into the first stitch on your front needle and on your back needle. First stitch is always the hardest, I find. You're going to knit those 2 stitches together, then take them off the 2 parallel needles, knit another pair of stitches together, take them off the parallel needles, and then pass the earlier stitch over the later stitch to bind off. Keeping in mind that you don't want this to be tight. You want to have some stretch in it. You don't want it to be sloppy either. So just kind of mind the bind off as you go. Keep an eye on it. Okay, and again, when you get to the last stitch, if your yarn is attached to your ball, then cut it, and if not, just pull that stitch free, and you've got an end to weave in and have a look. Okay, so if you finish and you find that your bind off is too tight or too loose, what do? You just pull that end out and just pull it out. It's like it'll unzip across here, slip your stitches back on your needle and do it again. So this it's not a huge long seam, so if you need to do it again, it's okay. All right, let's move on to the next step.